Thanks to my patrons for sponsoring this video. I've left a link in the description, so if you'd like to help support this channel, then check it out. Also, just very quickly, my book Here and Queer has been out for a while now in English, but I have just had copies of two other language versions, the French version and the Danish version, which is very exciting. So I think they're available to pre-order now. If you are a queer girl or have a queer girl in your life that you think would benefit from a Queer Girl's Guide to Life, which includes stuff to do with our history, activism, coming out or not, in this beautiful little, wonderful illustrations, trans-inclusive queer guide to life, I guess check it out. Link will be in the description as well. In 2020, a few significant things happened, but probably the most significant was that filmmaker James Gunn tweeted in his original script for the live-action Scooby-Doo movies, the character of Velma was explicitly gay. He wrote, "I tried. In 2001, Velma was explicitly gay in my original script, but the studio just kept watering it down and watering it down, becoming ambiguous, the version shot, then nothing, the version released, and finally having a boyfriend, the sequel." And this wasn't the last time that a creator tried to portray Velma as a lesbian. The former supervising producer for Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, which premiered in 2010, also said, "We always planned on Velma acting a little off and out of character when she was dating Shaggy, because that relationship was wrong for her, and she had unspoken difficulty with the why. There are hints about the why in that episode with the mermaid, and if you follow the entire Marcy arc, it seems as clear as we could make it 10 years ago." Then, in 2022, Velma finally got to be a fully realised lesbian character in Trick or Treat Scooby-Doo, falling hard for crime boss Coco Diablo. Queer fans rejoiced that a beloved cartoon character could finally come out of the celluloid closet, but it raises the question, why did it take so long? For over 20 years, writers, directors, and producers have interpreted the character as queer and wanted to portray her as such. And yet, this never made it to the screen. So what happened that stopped it becoming reality until this year? Well, you see, Velma and so many characters like her fell victim to a fun little thing called straightwashing. What is straightwashing? So essentially, straightwashing is when queerness is erased from content to appeal to a heterosexual audience. And this can take a number of forms. The first is portraying a queer character as heterosexual, like Velma in the 2001 live-action film. Initial script Velma is a lesbian, but final movie Velma is straight. Velma was straightwashed. The second type of straightwashing manifests in other, more subtle ways, downplaying queerness in marketing campaigns. For example, while Breakback Mountain is generally regarded to be a very gay movie, promotional posters like this one didn't really give that impression. It deliberately misrepresents the queer content of the movie so as not to put off a heterosexual or homophobic audience. This straightwashing or straightbaiting has also happened with the marketing of similarly queer movies like Call Me By Your Name or Pride. The third form of straightwashing is watering down the portrayal of a queer character to make them more palatable for homophobic viewers. Think about how Modern Family didn't depict Cam and Mitchell, a married gay couple, kissing until the second season, and then the kiss itself was easy to miss and to cut out thanks to it happening in the background of a busy shot. The show portrays Cam and Mitchell as gay, but especially in the earlier seasons, the writers and producers were careful to never portray them as too gay. In addition to being physically unaffectionate, both characters were also shockingly apolitical. And finally, straightwashing can also mean removing or omitting queer characters or storylines entirely. Instead of making a gay character straight, they just get rid of that character altogether. Whether it's a misleading movie poster, a deleted queer subplot, or a rewritten character, straightwashing takes queer stories and twists them into something more palatable for a heterosexual, or rather homophobic audience. In this video, we're first going to explore instances of straightwashing across multiple genres. Then we'll discuss why it occurs and finally reflect on the consequences of straightwashing itself. With these examples, we're going to be going from least to most egregious. First, let's take a look at straightwashing in original content. Take, for example, the film Whip It, a 2009 movie starring Elliot Page as Bliss Cavender, a Texas teen who secretly joins a roller derby team. Now, a lot of sports are kind of gay when you think about it, but roller derby, it might genuinely be the gayest sport in the world, both in terms of its players and its fans. Like, I would be surprised if you told me that there was a roller derby team out there with a majority straight and cis players. The sport is very inclusive, like from its very foundations, and for many queer athletes, a source of community. However, in the film Whip It, there are no queer characters, not even in the background, and as far as I'm aware, there were never any queer characters in the script. This was essentially straightwashed from the get-go. The cast of Whippet has talked about the lack of LGBTQ+ representation in the film after the fact. Ari Grainer, who played Ava Destruction in the film, campaigned for her character to be a lesbian, saying, "I was pushing for Eva to be a lesbian seductress, hitting on all the girls. I tried to push the envelope a little on stuff that didn't end up in the film." In 2018, Elliot Page expressed regret that the film didn't represent the reality of the roller derby community, saying, "A movie like Whippet, should be more queer. It's just that simple. It wasn't a realistic reflection of the derby world, and I wish that was different. I love that film, just want to be clear, but yeah, of course, looking back on that, that's a bummer. It's a reflection of the time." We see many movies in genres like wartime epic or action thriller make arguments against LGBTQ+ inclusion because of the type of story that they tell, supposedly necessitating a cast of all straight cis people, often all white, straight men. Yet we get a whole movie about roller derby and still not a queer person to be found. Seems suspicious to me. And these aren't the only actors who've wished their movies were, a little bit gayer. While making the Pitch Perfect franchise, actors Anna Kendrick and Brittany Snow felt that there was queer subtext between their characters, as did every fanfiction writer on the planet, by the way. During the Pitch Perfect 3 shoot, Kendrick claims that she and Snow tricked everyone into filming a gay ending in the hopes that it would be used. I definitely wanted to have an ending that was a Becklo ending, and we did shoot one version where Brittany and I tricked everybody into just shooting one that was just the two of us getting together. We knew it was a long shot. It meant so much to us that there was this following around their latent relationship, and yeah, I thought it would have been really cool if it would have ended up coming to fruition in the end. But despite the interest of actors during production, both Whippet and Pitch Perfect were working with straight scripts. Well, as straight as scripts about all-girl a cappella groups and roller derby can be. And so it isn't a real surprise that they ended up being straight movies. As far as straightwashing goes, this is very tame, barely a thing at all. Kind of disappointing, but it wasn't on the cards from the start. But there are some straightwash movies that have queer scripts to begin with and then become straightwashed in the edit. In Welcome Home, Roxy Carmichael, the original cut of the film was a queer coming out story, but it didn't stay gay in the end. According to the director, at test screenings, people were kind of shocked to see the two women in bed. I think we miscalculated the reaction. So before its wide release, the film was dramatically re-edited to be significantly less gay, and basically identical straightwashing processes happen to LA Story and Now and Then. But not all straightwashing edits happen due to test screenings. In Love Actually, there was originally a queer storyline between two lesbians played by Anne Reid and Frances de la Tour. The storyline was ultimately cut, not due to audience reactions, but due to director and writer Richard Curtis's worry that the movie was too long. It was a creative choice, not a marketing choice, but one that may well have been informed by homophobic bias, because, it involved keeping all the straight stories intact at the expense of the one queer one. And finally, there are many films and TV shows that are straightwashed during distribution. For example, a gay kiss in the delightful comedy show Schitt's Creek was censored by the UK channel 4 Music, much to the frustration of creator Dan Levy and Schitt's Creek fans. The channel claims that the deleted kiss was accidental and apologised, but that wasn't the last time Schitt's Creek fell victim to straightwashing. Comedy Central India tweeted a promo clip from Schitt's Creek with the characters all playing Spin the Bottle, but the kiss between two men, Ted and David, was cut. Queer content never becomes safe from straightwashing, even after the film is finished, and nowhere is that more evident than in straightwashed adaptations. When an existing piece of intellectual property, like a book or a play, has significant queer characters, themes, and storylines, but loses this element when adapted into a movie or TV show, that's straightwashing, baby. Gay in the original, straight in the remake. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the Hays Code, which we love to talk about on this channel, prevented the depiction of homosexuality on the grounds of it being morally reprehensible. So straightwashing was a mandatory part of the process of adaptation at the time if you wanted to get your movie made. Sometimes this straightwashing simply changed a single character, like in Breakfast at Tiffany's. In the original short story, the character of Paul is most likely bisexual, but this was removed from the film adaptation. But sometimes the straightwashing changes more than a single characterization. In the film adaptation of Tennessee Williams's Cat on the Hot Tin Roof, the potential queerness of Brick and Skipper is completely erased. In the play, their repressed sexuality and relation to each other drives the plot forwards. straightwashing fundamentally changes the story. Even after the Hays Code was lifted, the legacy of straightwashing in film adaptations lingered, with censorship in the minds and imaginations of filmmakers. In the novel The Colour Purple, Shug is bisexual and Celie is a lesbian. Author Alice Walker campaigned to keep the queerness in the film adaptation, but Spielberg took things in a different direction. In a 2011 interview looking back on the film, he said, "The other criticism was that I had softened the book. I've always copped to that. I made the movie I wanted to make from Alice Walker's book. Alice was on the set a lot of the time and could have always stepped forward to say, you know, this is too Disney. This is not the way I envisioned the scene going down. She was very supportive during filmmaking, and so I felt that we were doing a good job adapting her novel. There were certain things in the lesbian relationship between Shug, Avery and Celie that were finely detailed in Alice's book that I didn't feel could get a PG-13 rating. And I was shy about it. In that sense, perhaps I was the wrong director to acquit some of the more sexually honest encounters between Shug and Celie, because I did soften those. I basically took something that was extremely erotic and very intentional, and I reduced it to a simple kiss. I got a lot of criticism for that." When asked if he would direct the film differently now, he doubled down on his prior decisions, saying, "I wouldn't, no. That kiss is consistent with the tonality, from beginning to end, of The Colour Purple that I adapted." Like Love Actually, this wasn't external censorship, but an internal creative decision. To me, the straightwashing of The Colour Purple demonstrates the need for more queer directors. We'll talk about the impact of the practice in more depth later in the video, but I just wanted to highlight this element here. If these quotes are the truth, then this wasn't down to some studio interference suppressing a creative vision. Straightwashing was the creative vision. Film adaptations necessitate making changes from the source material, and for Spielberg, the original queerness wasn't important enough to preserve. I find it hard to believe that a queer director choosing to direct that story would have made the same choice. There are truly so many examples of straightwashing within adaptations, and what's truly bizarre about that to me is that in order for a piece of literature to get an adaptation, said piece of literature has to already be reasonably popular. Post Hays Code, straightwashing implies to me that the film industry assumes that queer literature is popular in spite of its queerness, not because of it, that they can remove it with little to no consequence, and nowhere is that rhetoric more evident than with the straightwashing of superhero movies. Comic books are, perhaps surprisingly to those who see them as the purview of straight white fanboys akin to the comic book guy in The Simpsons, actually pretty queer. Both DC and Marvel have an abundance of queer compelling characters with complicated character arcs and narratives of their own. Characters like Mystique, Deadpool, John Constantine, Wonder Woman, Star-Lord, Loki, Valkyrie, Red Robin, Iceman, and Harley Quinn. And those are just some of the big hitters. To be clear, LGBTQ+ representation within comic books is not perfect, but it is miles above LGBTQ+ representation within comic book adaptations. The queer characters who do make it to the big screen mainly just become straight, like Star-Lord, Wonder Woman, Mystique. But when DC or Marvel characters are allowed a queer moment in these movies, it's just that, a moment. In Harley Quinn Birds of Prey, there's a blink and you'll miss it implication that Harley used to have a girlfriend during the animated prologue. In Loki has a single conversation that alludes to previous male lovers. In Multiverse of Madness, America Chavez wears a pride flag pin. The latest MCU offering, Black Panther Wakanda Forever, includes a millisecond kiss on the forehead and a quick "thank you, my love," making it clear that these characters are romantically linked. It's a ridiculously minuscule moment that some people I know who watched the movie actually did blink and miss, and it doesn't seem to have any other discernible hints throughout the movie that this relationship is a thing, and it's already been removed from at least one country's cut of the movie. These barely there indicators of queerness seem deliberately easy to remove from the film. In an article about how the movie failed to deliver on promises of black queer representation, writer Gabriella Guy Singer wrote that in the MCU, there is no development for these queer characters, no longing glances or held hands, no overprotectiveness on the battlefield or friendly jesting after a victory. We know nothing about their internal lives, their arcs, their feelings. Their queerness is ripe for the cutting room floor. Yes, it is refreshing to have casual references to queer relationships and people thrown into big franchise movies, but when those moments are being held up as proof of progress within one of the biggest franchises at the biggest film studio on this great earth, it's just not accurate. Marvel's queer characters are yet to have holistic, well-rounded development and a journey that resonates. Sorry, Valkyrie. Not because they are queer, but because it's right to include queerness in organic and realistic ways. The comic books have introduced queer characters without the art form suffering in popularity. If anything, this kind of representation, for example, the fan favourite relationship between Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy, has potentially brought in a wider audience. Deadpool is popular and pansexual. The success of their stories doesn't depend on their heterosexuality, it depends on the quality of the stories. Several prominent actors, directors, and writers for major comic book movies have expressed a desire to stop straightwashing these characters. Ryan Reynolds, Margot Robbie, and Tessa Thompson have championed the potential for their characters to be portrayed as queer to varying levels of success. So people want to make gay superhero movies and people want to see gay superhero movies, and yet nothing substantial is being made. It's beyond frustrating, but perhaps not as frustrating as our final straightwashed genre, biopics. Here's a fun fact for you. LGBTQ+ people exist, not just now, also in the past. And LGBTQ+ people have played important roles throughout history, politically and culturally, but you wouldn't know that based on a whole lot of historical dramas. At this point, I think we've reached the apex of straightwashing's audacity in this video to literally change the sexuality of real people and communities to fit with heteronormative sensibilities. Some historical dramas and biopics choose simply to erase queer historical figures altogether, or dramatically reduce their role, regardless of their real historical importance. So let's start first with a more broad example, and one that immediately comes to mind would be the original League of Their Own, which is set in the world of women's baseball, specifically the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Women who played in the league in real life have spoken about the overwhelming queerness of its ranks in reality. Player Maybelle Blair, for example, estimated, out of 650, I bet you 400 were gay. So many of the girls came in from the farms, and they came in from all over the United States, and a lot of them thought they were alone too, and we had quite a time. There were so many gays in the league, it was amazing. Yet the movie has no queer characters. Luckily, we now have the TV show, which rectifies this with a much more realistically queer set of storylines, but this just serves to make the initial omission even more glaring. Any movies surrounding the suffragist and suffragette movements seem to leave the many lesbians not just in the everyday supporters, but also the very leadership of the movement out of the story completely. And similarly, we have the movie Stonewall, which focuses on the famous Stonewall riots that are credited as the catalyst for the modern queer rights movement in America. The movie came under fire for the choice to tell the story of this movement through the lens of a cis white gay boy, created for the purposes of the movie, arguably minimizing the importance of black and trans activists during Stonewall. But you could argue that this criticism is more a matter of perspective. After all, there were cis white gay boys at Stonewall, and nobody technically knows who threw the first brick. So it's just a lens through which to view historical events. However, sometimes key players are left out of the story altogether, or at least their queerness is. Take Bayard Rustin. He was an activist who was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. He was also gay. It's impossible to overemphasize Rustin's importance and influence over the civil rights movement. Not only did he co-organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, by many accounts, he was the one who influenced Dr. Martin Luther King to embrace nonviolence via his Quaker upbringing. In one letter in 1960, King wrote, "We are thoroughly committed to the method of nonviolence in our struggle, and we are convinced that Bayard's expertness and commitment in this area will be of unestimable value." However, in the few film depictions of the civil rights movement, Rustin is almost always left out. In Selma, Rustin technically appears, but the film never draws attention to him. As one article put it, Rustin does not get directly identified to us in Selma, and for whatever reason, his influence on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his work behind the scenes barely receive screen time. While great pains were taken to identify the major players behind the Selma March, Rustin is the one pivotal player whose name is never spoken to him at any point during the film's 127 minutes. Selma is an incredible film, don't misunderstand me here, but I think a lot of people who know of Rustin's contributions wonder what a film about this vital part of American history looks like when the portrayal of that time is allowed to be complete with the work of queer black figures too. Side note, we are going to find out what that would look like, because in 2023 there is a biopic about Rustin that I have talked about on this channel like ages ago that is finally due to be released on Netflix. This kind of straightwashing happens on TV too. The NBC drama Rise, for example, is based on a real-life gay drama teacher And in the show, the drama teacher is, of course, straight. So whether it's a high school drama teacher or a leader of the civil rights movement, straightwashing depictions of real people and real events isn't just frustrating, it's also potentially harmful when it's so widespread. Why does straightwashing happen? Straightwashing, as evidenced by the first part of this video, is not restricted to a particular genre or type of character. It can be brought into a production at any stage, from the initial conception of the story to the edit room after queer scenes have been filmed. But why is it happening? To my mind, there are three elements that seem to go into these decisions. A triangle of straightwashing, and where production falls on the triangle can show the motives behind how they treat their queer characters, whether completely straightwashed, relegated to background players, or allowed to lead the stories that they should be a part of. Money. The first, and I imagine the one that most people think of when this topic comes up, is money. For those that defend straightwashing, this is the "that's just how the world works, life's unfair, kid" argument, right? If queer people won't make as much money, of course they should be able to erase them. But does the data support this? Well, it's complicated. In 2020, one researcher set out to look at the profitability of LGBTQ+ movies across the previous decade, but stumbled at the very first hurdle, having enough releases to give meaningful data. Ellie Lockhart found that just 2% of movies released during that period had explicit LGBTQ+ representation. At all, not even lead characters. And for recently, many of those were released purely on streaming sites where no revenue is reported, so no mark of profitability can be determined. Another study by Monash University, published in the Journal of Business Ethics, looked at a wider time frame and found that LGBT inclusive movies earned a staggering 29% more revenue at the box office than movies with no LGBT content, concluding that with global box office revenue reaching $42 billion in 2019, this means LGBT inclusive films are big business on and off screen. However, it's interesting to note their definition of LGBT inclusive. In analysing the films, we classified all movies into three categories: non-LGBT movies, LGBT inclusive movies, and LGBT themed movies. LGBT inclusive movies are those that include LGBT characters or plots, but do not make them the main focus or theme of the movie. LGBT inclusive and LGBT themed were two distinct categories for these researchers, and the LGBT inclusive movies that performed so well were deliberately walking a line between giving some level of diversity for queer audiences, but also being background enough in their identities to not alienate homophobic or transphobic viewers either. Of course, there will be some movies with consequential representation, but to my mind, that shouldn't be the end goal of all LGBTQ+ cinema. But there is hope for those movies that do focus on queerness. Although LGBT-themed movies, such as Brokeback Mountain and The Kids Are Alright, were not as commercially successful as LGBT-inclusive movies, their reception kept improving over the years, and they performed equally as well as non-LGBT movies more recently. This suggests that the tide is turning. It's also interesting to see now iconic movies like Brokeback spoken about in the context of revenue alone as financial failures. I think this more than anything showcases how profit is not the only marker of success when it comes to cultural products like movies. There has been much talk recently about the death of the mid-budget movie, which is where queer stories used to thrive once they were allowed to be more mainstream than low-budget indie cult classics. This has undoubtedly also affected the amount of money that LGBTQ+ movies can bring in. If all the big money makers are blockbusters and superhero movies that refuse to have LGBTQ+ characters, how can you expect massive profits for LGBTQ+ movies when they aren't included in these genres? Social attitudes. The second corner of this heady triangle is social attitudes, aka homophobia, whether conscious and deliberate or unconscious and created through ignorance. I think that some filmmakers have a sense of complacency when it comes to representation. They've always been used to straight, white, often male leads in the movies they admire, and so they unthinkingly replicate this, especially as they themselves likely fall into this demographic. It's this sense of unquestioning assumptions that this is how it's always been and should therefore stay that way. So even when a story appears that has queerness in its origins, the change to straight feels obvious because that's just how it's done, right? I think that ignorance shouldn't be ignored or downplayed just because it isn't overtly malicious. If you were to press these creators on that decision, if they had any justification at all beyond unthinking precedent, they might come up with the classic idea that to add in queerness would be too complicated. This is clearly a byproduct of the idea that the straight white cis male default lead character, where everything that changes then becomes a distraction from a pure storyline that doesn't have to deal with things like sexism, racism, or homophobia. The implication that it would muddle the story, distract from the real heart or message, rather than reflect reality for the majority of the population is beyond frustrating. Because the thing is, it has the potential to make a story better. Queerness doesn't have to be a complication in a negative way, but instead add an element of narrative complexity that serves the story itself. The X-Men movies, for example, don't include Mystique's bisexuality, but isn't there obvious potential in the idea of a queer mutant who can shift between appearances and sexes, especially when mutants have long been seen for their metaphoric potential as a marginalized community? I mean, I made a whole video about how making Carol Danvers gay in Captain Marvel would only have added to the story and setting. Yeah, especially with these big blockbusters, with the idea of including prominent queer characters as a lead or even having them as supporting or background characters, there is resistance. The social attitudes, not just of the filmmakers, but prospective audiences come into play. The international market won't like it is a common refrain. It won't fly in Russia and China. This censorship also happens in the UK and the US too, it should be noted. See the changing of sailors Uranus and Neptune from girlfriends to cousins in the US airing of Sailor Moon, or the removal of a kiss between Pearl and Rose Quartz in Steven Universe in the UK, for example. And arguably, censoring yourself to comply with homophobic markets abroad is as much an indicator of your own homophobia as it is theirs. You just don't support equality enough to stand by it when profit is on the line. And this is how the triangle begins to connect. Rather than remaining three disparate points in this phenomenon, it's not just about the sensibilities of a potential audience, but also how those sensibilities will affect the bottom line. When we look at straightwashing in marketing, there is this idea that erasing queerness from the heart of the story will appeal to a broader audience. The DVD cover of Pride in the US removed all mentions of the fact that it centers around gay and lesbian activists. It seems to suggest that there is an attempt to appeal to a hypothetical audience that are okay with activist stories, but wouldn't be okay with it being queer, which to me feels like a pretty small demographic compared to the potential interest created from actually queer hypothetical audiences who might otherwise miss out on what they didn't realise was a film about their own history. And what of those straight posters for Brokeback Mountain or Call Me By Your Name? What happens when these unsuspecting straights wander into this movie anticipating a good old heterosexual romantic drama? If the idea of queerness on a poster was enough to put them off, surely the explicit queer scenes in these types of movie would not get their real support. And again, risks actual queer audiences passing over the movie entirely. It leaves queer audiences behind who don't get the memo that this is about them and that they will be interested, especially where they might be in a place to become its biggest champions. Artistic choices. And finally, let's talk about the third corner, artistic choices. The idea that some writers and directors remove queerness because it doesn't align with their vision. In recent years, we've seen more and more writers and directors being questioned about the lack of diversity in their careers to date. The whiteness of Tim Burton's filmography was highlighted when he cast his first ever black lead in the adaptation of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children a few years ago. When asked about this, he responded that, "Nowadays, people are talking about it more. Things either call for things or they don't. I remember back when I was a child watching The Brady Bunch and they started to get all politically correct. Like, okay, let's have an Asian child and a black. I used to get more offended by that than just... I grew up watching blaxploitation movies, right? And I said, that's great. I didn't go like, okay, there should be more white people in these movies." This was met with some inevitable backlash from people essentially interpreting it as Burton saying that people of colour basically don't fit into his aesthetic, that they're too politically correct to shove into the fantastical worlds that he's created from the ground up, which don't include people who aren't white, apparently. In the responses, we can see how these artistic choices aren't just informed by social attitudes and biases around the filmmakers, but also feed back into our culture to reinforce them. I think it's really interesting that he sort of name drops the blaxploitation genre in here, because essentially he seems to be saying like, well, here's a genre where everyone's black and no one's saying anything about how there aren't white people in there, which is interesting considering that blaxploitation is a genre that, like, it's not incidentally black, right? Like, it's black by design for very specific reasons, and a lot of the stories are about or have commentaries on the experience of blackness in some way, right? So is he arguing that, like, Tim Burton, my filmography, is about whiteness? Like, this is the reason why I don't have people who aren't white, because the movies I'm making are about white people and the concept of whiteness? Because I feel like that's not what they are. And I think even if you can make the argument that they can be sort of interpreted that way, I genuinely don't think that that is what Tim Burton is trying to do. A lifelong Burton fan, Daksha Pillai, wrote about how this had put his filmography into perspective for them, describing him as the creative genius who ruled much of my childhood imagination with his gothic whimsy, before realising that there was an appalling lack of diversity in some of the movies that had shaped my childhood. Worse than that, it seemed like their creator didn't really care. I want him and others who don't get what the fuss is all about to understand why diversity in all avenues is important, how media can affect the people who consume it, and how unconventional people can still have conventional biases. This same unthinking recreation of whiteness in film is often also true of other marginalizations, like sexuality, gender, but also disability and class. Sometimes these omissions aren't baked into the creative process from the beginning, but come later in the edit suite. And if you think about it, for you to be able to remove a character's queerness entirely within the edit by cutting a few seconds here and there, was that truly an authentic portrayal of queerness? Or was it a momentary sprinkle of supposed diversity ready to be cut out? If it had so little effect on the character or story that it could be erased with no meaningful consequences to the rest of the movie, was it going to be even passable representation to begin with? Actor Tessa Thompson has confirmed, for example, that there was a moment cut from Thor Ragnarok. A scene of her leaving her room included a shot of a woman leaving with her, clearly meant to imply that they had spent the night together, but it was cut for pacing. Movies like Jungle Cruise, Beauty and the Beast, and The Rise of Skywalker all had single scenes or even blink and you'll miss it moments that were clearly made so they could easily be cut if necessary. They, like the queer characters themselves, were seen as dispensable and easily removable. Queer creators fighting censorship have had to make queerness integral to the story to ensure that it remains, and even then it can be a challenge. The creator of the cartoon show She-Ra, Noelle Stevenson, has pointed out that the finale, which included confirmed queerness in central characters She-Ra and Catra, almost didn't happen. It was sort of a push and pull for pretty much the entire length of the show about what we would be able to show and what we would have to keep between the lines. But when we reached that final season, I showed my cards to the people who had the right of refusal for that. And it was like, look, this is what we've been building to this whole time. This needs to happen for both of these characters. I wanted to make it so integral to the story in a way that, one, they wouldn't be able to take it out, and two, to give it a moment. It's the climax. It needs to be there. It needs to happen the way it does. And that was really important to me. And so the triangle is complete. Social attitudes affect artistic choices, which affect money, which the connections continue between these elements, ricocheting back and forth. To break the cycle of straightwashing, inevitably these elements need to change, or the importance of representation needs to be seen to be of higher value. What's the big deal? So why should straightwashing be something that people care about? Why should representation be valued over the erasure of LGBTQ+ characters? Why, I'm glad you asked, because there are actually a bunch of reasons, and I'm going to tell you about them. Okay, so first let's talk about the lack of representation to begin with, that hasn't been censored or straightwashed. Accurate estimates of the total percentage of a population who are LGBTQ+ is tricky for a variety of reasons, not least because disclosure might be actively dangerous for some people. But especially in younger generations, we are seeing an increasing number of people identifying as queer in some way. I don't think this is some hormones in the water conspiracy. I just think it's a testament to how othered LGBTQ+ identities have been. With the increased visibility of our current community and our lives, there comes an increased openness within individuals to actively examine their feelings and the effects of heteronormativity. So many queer people I know have joked about how when they came out to their mum or their dad or their gran, they said something like, well, we've all had some feelings like that, or when I was a girl, we all kissed our friends. And you're like, oh, you were living in a different time, but if you had been born today, maybe you would have felt more validated to explore what could very well have been a bisexual identity, for example. The "you can't be what you can't see" adage seems strange when you're talking about a born this way idea of identity, right? But I think that it's more true than it might seem at first. You'll still have the still type of feelings internally, regardless of what representation you see on screen. But that representation, when done well, can help you make sense of what you are feeling, make you feel less alone. If you're a girl who feels attraction to girls but has never seen that as a possibility, you might repress, reject, or fear those feelings. You might misinterpret them as intense friendship or sinful predatory thoughts. But not only does representation give the gifts of seeing our specific sexuality on screen, it also has the power to position that identity within a wider character. Sexuality doesn't have to be an entire character and focus of the story. You can have these feelings, but also have hopes and dreams and fears intertwined and separate from that. So when straightwashing rears its head, it's inevitably in stories where someone's sexuality was just that, a part of them in a story focused on their other wants, needs, and desires. Instead of allowing for complex queer characters who have these different aspects of their story, they're erased to make room for more straight ones. Figures for LGBTQ+ representation might have been steadily improving as a trend over time, although they often go up and down year to year. But if we look at the decades-long backlog of no LGBTQ+ characters at all, the state of the overall world of queer characters across film and TV history is woeful. Even characters with seemingly incidental sexualities will be affected by their queerness. So what do we lose from a character when we lose their sexuality? To many of us, our queer identity is an important part of what makes up the totality of us. Our experiences in a world that has historically been hostile to us will inevitably have left a mark. In a similar way, there's a layer of potential depth that may well be stripped away by the removal of a character's sexuality. It might be a layer of motivation, an internal journey, a familial tension. I spoke about it in my Captain Marvel video, but Maria being sad her best friend Carol died is a pretty straightforward level of emotionality and pathos. But Maria being unable to publicly mourn the woman she loves for fear that it would also mean losing her career and income as she raises a daughter as a single mother during the era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, suddenly it adds something much bigger to that arc. For some people, queerness is a background element of their existence that doesn't necessarily have a material effect on their day-to-day lives every day, but for others it is tied to their friendships, community, jobs, neighborhoods, self-expression, as well as their relationships. And so, if representation is to be authentic and given to complex characters, it shouldn't be so easy to remove their sexuality without also removing that depth. But more than that, we see straightwashing used in instances of real people in biopics and based on true story scripts. And this is indicative of a wider pattern of straightwashing history. I made a whole video essay about the history of queer censorship and another one on the history of anti-LGBTQ+ indoctrination in schools if you want to look at this in much more depth. But the point I want to pull out here is how ingrained it has been in education to cut out LGBTQ+ contributions, history, and culture, even when it is already relevant to the syllabus that you are studying. The anti-LGBTQ+ elements of the Holocaust, for example, were given a one-word mention in a single sentence in my high school textbook. I tutored students in English literature who were learning about the plays of Oscar Wilde and had never been told that he was queer, concealing from them a vital part of his biography which unlocks new meaning in the work that they were studying, because it wasn't seen as appropriate to even acknowledge it to these students. When you erase an entire demographic or community, it becomes easier to enforce the lie that they are other, that they are lesser, because they haven't contributed or they are some modern invention. Straightwashing in this context does a disservice to real people's legacy. Queer people have always been here. In history, we were present in the reality that war movies, thrillers, spy films, romances, and comedies are based on. Our inclusion is simply fact, not political correctness or pandering. And so our removal is not a reflection of reality, it's a choice. And we should be questioning why that choice keeps being made. Thank you so much for watching my last video of 2022. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to help support these videos, then I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description, and also links to my social media, so you can find me all over the internet. And as I said earlier, I will leave the links to do with my book Here and Queer in the description. If you have already bought it or can't afford it, then please request it from your local library. They should be able to buy it in. And if you are like a teacher or librarian, please consider having books like Here and Queer in your collection so that young people can have access to the information that they need. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the year, and until I see you next time, bye.